Magic is a game with over 1,000 different sets and tens of thousands of cards having been printed over the course of nearly 30 years. Building a game with this many pieces is a constant learning experience, discovering what players enjoy, what makes for a fun game, and perhaps most importantly, designing cards that are exciting to play with, but without making cards that feel too weak or too powerful. People like to play with strong cards, but too strong and it no longer becomes fun. Too weak and nobody's interested in using them.
There it is. Go for maybe a Vraska's Contempt here. No. It's going to get Essence Scattered, and that's going to get negated. And there's another Essence Scatter there for Thompson, so he fights the fight. But all of this could easily be leading the way for you-know-who. Big Daddy Scarab God. And there he is. Oh, hey, look. 4 mana available.
Cards which are too weak usually end up forgotten, left in the abyss of other cards nobody remembers, resting alongside bulk rares and forgettable commons. Even among casual tables, in formats like Commander, these cards still see no play. On the opposite side of the spectrum lies cards that are too powerful, breaking formats and forever burning the image of that card into the minds of players who had the misfortune of playing against them. These kinds of cards have existed for as long as the game has been around, with perhaps the most notorious of all broken cards, the Power 9. 9 cards first introduced in Alpha which still stand as some of the strongest game pieces ever printed. Atop this pedestal sits the crown jewel of the collection, a singular lone flower. Of course, these are not the only cards to ever be considered broken. Were that the case, the different game formats would not have ban lists. While a stray card here or there can become problematic, sometimes it's entire groups of cards that prove to just be all too powerful, a story we have seen repeat itself throughout Magic's history. Today, I'd like to share with you a few tales about broken cards in Magic, and what they mean for the game as a whole.
Turn force and tap this. Block here, block here, block here. Come on, you gotta slop it. What are you doing?
Who's the fast talker?
That's Mike. He starts playing as fast as he can once he sees a weakness.
Flip it.
In the yesteryear of 1998, Wizards of the Coast released the first set themed around enchantments, Urza Saga. Now, while the set was originally themed around enchantments, in practice the artifacts in the following block were far more powerful than many of the enchantments, and Urza's block is better remembered for its powerful artifacts, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Urza Saga released in October of 1998, and after a whole year without any standard bans, that was about to change. December 1998 was only the beginning. The first 2 cards to be banned in Standard were Tolarian Academy and Windfall. While I was unable to locate the actual banned and restricted announcement, Windfall is ridiculously easy to cast on turn 1, especially in conjunction with cards such as Lotus Petal, Grim Monolith, and Tolarian Academy, which is also featured on this list. This ease of casting effectively makes it a draw 7, and your opponent simply discards the hand that they decided to keep and instead draws a new hand of 7 that they cannot choose to mulligan. Tolarian Academy needs no explanation as to its banning, as the amount of artifacts that cost 0 or 1 mana make it trivially easy to get this card to tap for multiple mana very early on. The most prominent deck list that included these cards is just a big pile of card draw, aiming to amass mana until you have enough to deck your opponent by casting Stroke of Genius, generating mana through Time Spiral and Bind Over Matter. Despite the banning of these cards, the standard metagame continued to be centered around powerful combos, and the time period became known as Combo Winter. An article written by Randy Buehler showcases many of the decks prevalent at the time, but the card in particular I want to focus on from among these lists is Yawgmoth's Bargain. I think this card is very indicative of the thought process in Urza's block. When this card was released, the intention was for it to be the fixed version of Necropotence, a very powerful enchantment that actually managed to fly under the radar when the card first came out. This led to a time period known as Black Summer, and so when R&D decided to make an enchantment-themed set, they revisited Necropotence, and decided to print a version of the card that wasn't as easy to play. The problem was that they made a better version of the card, as Necropotence made you wait until the end step in order to put the cards into your hand, while Yawgmoth's Bargain just gave them to you immediately. By March of 1999, combo decks continued to prove nigh unstoppable, so another banned and restricted announcement came out adding 6 more cards to the ban list. Dream Halls, Earthcraft, Fluctuator, Lotus Petal, Recurring Nightmare, and Time Spiral. In addition to these bans, a power level errata was issued for all the free creatures printed in Urza Saga, where they would only untap your lands if you had played them from your hand. Priest of Gix also received the same errata. This was likely to stop the powerful synergy these cards had with Recurring Nightmare and Sneak Attack, which are both mentioned by name in this announcement. Of all the cards on this list, I think Fluctuator is perhaps the strangest inclusion when viewing this announcement over 20 years in the future. The reason the DCI gave was that they believed that if left unchecked, Fluctuator decks would rise to the top, which was also their fear with Recurring Nightmare. Despite the significant number of cards banned, we're still not done talking about Urza Block, because just before this announcement was made, Urza's Legacy had hit store shelves, and there's one card in particular that would prove to be problematic: Memory Jar. Right away, Memory Jar just tells you to draw 7 cards, in similar fashion to Windfall, and in a format that has access to cards like Grim Monolith, getting to 5 colorless mana is not as hard as you might think. The Memory Jar decks seen at Grand Prix Vienna used Megrim as a win condition, where you'd sack multiple Memory Jars to constantly refill your hand and cause your opponent to repeatedly exile theirs and draw 7. Then cast Megrim and pass the turn, watching as your opponent discarded their hand, took 14 damage, and then returned the previous 7 cards to the hand, which would cause them to do it again. Just 10 days after the first announcement, Memory Jar became the first card ever to be emergency banned, finding itself either banned or restricted in every single format, where it largely remains today. In June of 1999, one final card would hit the standard ban list. Mind Over Matter can be a powerful mana accelerant when paired with a lot of card draw, something that Urza's Block was very good at doing. With this final banning, we see some silence in Standard, at least in terms of bans. Urza Block was likely a nightmare from an R&D perspective, as famously, R&D was called into the office of Vince Colori, the CEO of Wizards at the time, and told that if they ever broke the constructed environment like that again, they would be fired. But how did the set ever get to where it was? What happened? Well, Randy Buehler remarks that this block is a major turning point in the game because it marks the beginning of when the player base had surpassed R&D in terms of deck building. Urza's Block was not as well tested as it should have been, and players immediately recognized very powerful synergies that R&D had simply not thought of. By the end of the year, they had hired many pro-level players in order to help better playtest cards, which I would argue has been largely successful. Of course, the developers of Magic the Gathering are only human, and while things largely settled down towards the end of 1999, we wouldn't have to wait that long for another back-breaking block to be released. The year is 2003, and we've just seen the release of Mirrodin, a set centered around the plane of the same name, which would set the stage for another block centered around artifacts. Mirrodin introduced to us a new type of artifact known as equipments. Equipment are pretty ubiquitous today, but back then they were brand new, allowing you to have what was effectively a repeatable aura that just hung out on the battlefield when not in use. While equipment were neat, there's another very important mechanic that Mirrodin introduced: Affinity, which reduced the cost of something depending on what the card had affinity for. In this set it was artifacts, but later sets in the block would experiment with different types of affinity. It's difficult to talk about Standard during this time, as Worlds 2003 took place a few months before the release of Mirrodin, and there weren't any Standard GPs for nearly a year. But that doesn't really matter because we don't yet have all the pieces necessary to talk about what made this time period so problematic. Flash forward to the release of Darksteel, and there are more affinity cards. This time some of them have affinity for the basic land types. The affinity cards are neat, but there are 2 other important cards that we need to know about: a small equipment card Skullclamp and Arcbound Ravager. For the low cost of 1 mana to cast and 1 mana to equip, Skullclamp turns any creature with 1 toughness into 2 cards, or with something like Arcbound Ravager, it doesn't even matter what the toughness of the creature is, it'll still draw you 2 cards. While Skullclamp fits itself into a host of decks, Arcbound Ravager was more tailor-made for affinity, as you needed a large number of artifacts in order to make the most of the card. While Arcbound Ravager is powerful, Skullclamp is just so universally strong, too strong almost, and if you need an example, look no further than Grand Prix Brussels 2004. After several months of no Standard GPs, Grand Prix Brussels showcased exactly what was unfolding in Standard at the time. So many of these decks are straight up running main deck artifact hate in order to beat Affinity or Skullclamp. Decks usually sit in one of 2 categories: decks running Skullclamp or decks running Damping Matrix. There's a notable exception in a Red-Green Beast deck, but even it has 4 copies of Viridian Shaman and 4 copies of Molder Slug. The overwhelming dominance of Skullclamp on the metagame led to a banned and restricted announcement on June 1st, 2004, saying that Skullclamp would be banned in both Standard as well as Mirrodin Block Constructed. Aaron Forsyth wrote an article after the announcement outlining exactly why Skullclamp was banned, which gives largely the same reasons I already covered. Perhaps the most interesting line in the article is, "We did not ban Skullclamp to hurt Affinity decks, as some players believe. We weren't out to kill one specific deck, and if we were, we would have chosen a different card, but rather to salvage the entire format. Some decks are just naturally going to be better than others, and if Affinity is one of the better decks, we're okay with that. What we're not okay with is having one card be the focal point of every viable strategy." This statement almost perfectly foreshadows what would happen in the coming months with the release of 5th Dawn, but the article also goes on to mention how the top decks in the format, which he lists as Goblins, Affinity, and Elfin Nail, a deck that uses mana-producing creatures in order to power out Tooth and Nail as fast as it can in order to stick threats like Darksteel Colossus to the board, all function very well without Skullclamp, but have insane potential when given access to the artifact. The end of the article is oddly prophetic about Skullclamp and its presence in the casual scene, saying while cards like Memory Jar and Mind Over Matter aren't cards that everyone can use in their decks, Skullclamp in contrast fits itself just about everywhere, a sentiment that still rings true today. The Skullclamp ban takes effect with the release of 5th Dawn, the last set in the Mirrodin Block. The set introduced several new mechanics such as scrying, something which today is evergreen. The card most relevant to our story is the 2-mana equipment known as Cranial Plating, and it immediately fills the hole that Skullclamp had left in the deck. While it doesn't provide you with insane card advantage, it does provide a significant damage boost, as well as allowing you to move the equipment at instant speed, ensuring that if a creature went unblocked, Cranial Plating would be attached to it. In the 2 Grand Prix that follow, we see Affinity consistently in the top 8 of these events, but they still had some competition in the form of Goblins as well as Astral Slide decks. The issue with these decks is that many of their pieces are tied to Onslaught Block, consisting of Onslaught, Legions, and Scourge, which were set to rotate out following the release of Champions of Kamigawa in October of 2004. Worlds 2004, held on September 5th, would be one of the last times that Onslaught Block was still legal in Standard. Here we get to see A.O. Paquette face off against Julian Newton. Paquette is playing Affinity while Newton is running green-white Astral Slide. In Game 1 we watched the powerful Astral Slide combo in conjunction with Viridian Shaman remove every creature and land Paquette can play from the board until Eternal Dragon is able to close out the game.
Instead of just Strap Blast. No, just an Orthopter. So, slight mistake from Julian Newton, but it doesn't matter.
Game 2 showcases just how strong Cranial Plating can be if every permanent you control is an artifact, winning Paquette the game on turn 4.
Oh, another Cranial Plating. Wow.
10 damage?
I think it's 9. 10? Okay. You're right, 10. 10 damage. Karl
He actually attacked turn 3
Newton,
for 10.
3. He's down to 3 as he untaps on his 3rd turn.
That's yep.
And yeah, there's nothing he's got. Scoops him up.
Okay.
Turn 4 kill.
Despite displaying the blazing speed the deck can have, the repeated artifact destruction that Astral Slide is capable of ends up winning Newton the match 3-1. Once Champions of Kamigawa enter Standard, the only legal sets were 8th Edition, Mirrodin, Darksteel 5th Dawn, and Champions of Kamigawa. The problem with trying to study this era is that there were no Standard events to look back on. For over a year, from September 2004 to March 2006, not a single Standard event was held. Champions of Kamigawa didn't have much it could do in terms of stopping Affinity, and so in March of 2005, a month after the release of Betrayers of Kamigawa, the Affinity Beast was finally slain, having a staggering 8 cards banned out of the deck. Of these 8 cards, 6 of them were the artifact lands. In an article titled 8+1, Aaron Forsyth again discusses the reason that these cards had to go, citing a large amount of player complaints about how the deck wasn't fun, and that even though its win statistics weren't lopsided enough to warrant banning the deck by itself, player outcry was significant enough to warrant removing some of the most crucial pieces, even if it meant hurting Krark Clan Ironworks, another prominent artifact deck, in the process, calling it guilt by association. One of the proposed ban lists included only the 6 artifact lands, but the DCI wanted to ensure that the deck stayed down, fearing that anyone who wanted to return to the game would be angry to find that Affinity was still a prevalent deck, so all of it had to go. Having lost so many of its crucial pieces, Affinity was finally dethroned in Standard until Mirrodin Block rotated out with the release of Ravnica, City of Guilds. It's hard to make thousands of cards for a game without running into a few problems. It's the nature of any job. Sometimes you'll fail. You have to push the design space in order to discover where the boundaries are. If R&D never tried to push the envelope in terms of card design, then the game would flare out pretty quickly because every set would feel the same as the last one. Sometimes a card is stronger than they could have anticipated, but that's not always a bad thing. A card can be strong without breaking a format, and you'll never know until that card shows up. In Sam Stoddard's article titled Developmental Mistakes, he outlines how Pack-Rat ended up being stronger than they had anticipated, but it didn't start seeing widespread play until the release of Theros in a mono-black devotion deck. One of the most important aspects of Magic that I enjoy is that these powerful cards exist almost like a memorial to the past. At one point in time though, this wouldn't have been the case. Wizards of the Coast used to issue power level erratas on cards, some of which I mentioned in this very video. These kinds of changes don't really happen anymore, and that is in part due to the fact that cards work best when they do what they say. I think it's just as important to let players experience playing these cards as they were created, warts and all. Though some of these cards may be too strong for certain formats, keeping them this way allows for Vintage to be the no-holds-barred format I feel it deserves to be. Of course, this spirit is not present on every problem card, and Sam talks about that too, specifically mentioning Scorched Ruins and Lotus Field. Sometimes it's better to fix a card so that it can see play. While pushing the envelope on new cards is important, it's equally as important to make sure that every new set doesn't make the old ones obsolete. I don't believe Magic should be a game about racing to collect every card in the newest set in order to stay competitive, but about collecting the cards that best appeal to you, and using them along with the other cards you've collected in order to build a deck that speaks to you as a player. And I think Magic does a pretty good job of doing just that. I just wanted to say one last thing. Thank you all so much for watching. I know that it's been a long time since I uploaded a video, but I have been working on stuff. I've been trying to split my time between university and this, and so during the summer I finally cranked out another video. And hopefully I will see you all sooner than I did last time with the next one. Thank you for watching.